She spent years in the trenches of network news, bringing us her stories with a refreshing and provocative perspective. Eventually, she left the networks, first for PBS, and then to do news for children on Nickelodeon. She's a mother, a best-selling author, and a cancer survivor. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with multiple Emmy and Peabody Award winner Linda Ellerbee. Once bit by the television bug, can you ever do anything else?
Yes, you can. I was writing for print before television, and I'm still writing books and writing magazine articles, but I will always work in television because I love making television. You know?
What is it about it? I don't think people outside of it understand.
Well, it's not the being on the air part I love so much. That's kind of like when you're in school and you do your geography notebook, and before you turn it in, they make you stand up and read it aloud to the class. I love the producing, the shooting, the editing, the writing. But then before I go home, they make me stand up and read it aloud to the class.
Yeah. Do we all, I should say, use this tool to the best of its ability today?
Few of us use it to the best of its ability. And I think partly that's because too many of the people in television believe, particularly television news, believe they're much smarter than the people who watch television news. So instead of giving them our very best, often people give them what they think they need or what they think they want or what they think they won't want to miss.
Yeah. How much of this came to your understanding of all of this from working with children, from doing the kids' news?
I think I understood most of this before. What's come to me from working with kids is, as a journalist, I've been forced to, look at all my assumptions and question them. And of course, the first one was about kids and their interest in the world and, discovering that they're very smart. They just happen to be shorter and younger.
Take me back. Start me off. Where did this love for you, informing people, educating people, sharing with people come from?
I think because I'm a Texan. We're storytellers. In my family, if you wanted to tell a story, you better understand that a story had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you got it out of order, you never got to finish.
Tell me this then. Was being unique, being a storyteller, being a Texan, as you put it, did that ever work against you in the hierarchy of network news? When you're in there and you're different, is that a problem?
Well, I don't mind being different. Only dead fish swim with the stream all the time. But at one time it did. At one time, one of the networks said, you sound like a Texan on the air. And I said, that's because I am. And they said, well, we want you to not sound like that. And I said, well, where should I sound like I'm from? And none of them had ever been to Texas or much of any place else. So one of the vice presidents said, well, try and sound like you come from my office. News from nowhere.
Did you then listen to what they were saying?
No, I never
tried. How did you know not to?
I never tried to get rid of my Texas accent. When I'm away from Texas, it just sort of goes away. Call it adaptive behavior. It just goes away. But when I'm home, give me 5 minutes, honey, and I can sound like a 9-car pileup on I-10.
Let me take you broader, though, than that,
Sure.
and ask you, when people are saying, and higher-ups are saying to you, you've got to be this way, you've got to do this, you've got to do it that way to be successful, how do you know when to listen to yourself and do what you think is right, and how do you know when to take the advice of other people? How do you balance that?
That's very simple. If you can't look at yourself in the mirror on the way to work and feel good about yourself, don't take their advice. And try to remember that the worst they can do is fire you. And there are worse things in life than that, and one of them is not being able to face yourself in the mirror. But the good news is, really doing it your way, what I discovered, that 90% of the time, or 99% of the time, they don't fire you. So do it your way.
Did you have times where you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror?
There were times that I didn't like what I was being asked to do, and I started to avoid it. That whole how do you feel question, I happen to personally believe that anybody who sticks a mic in the face of anyone who's undergone a personal tragedy, instantly and asks them anything at all is a moral dwarf.
Right.
And also not a good storyteller. So I didn't do that. But, I made plenty of other mistakes. To be on television for 30 years is to be no stranger to public humiliation.
Are there things you still cringe about that you did? Are there moments that still haunt you?
There are moments, not so much lapses in judgment, but there are certain, coming back from commercial on a live show and discovering you have a gumdrop in your mouth or a piece of gum. I remember one night on NBC News Overnight, the camera came back and I after commercial, and I realized I had gum in my mouth, and I looked straight in the camera and went, "Excuse me," and stuck it under the chair and kept going.
Yeah. Were there stories that you had to cover that challenged you to a point that you couldn't find the way to cover them?
All stories should be challenging. They really should. I think that it was interesting because I was one of the first group of women allowed in network news, and this was in the 70s at a time that the women's movement was exploding around the country, and they would send, of course, only women to cover stories about the women's movement, and then they would say, "Now, make sure you don't sound pro-women's movement." And I would think, now, would they tell a black person to go out and cover a story about civil rights, but make sure that you try to pretend you don't believe in civil rights? Those were a challenge.
But then what's the balance there, especially today? And we look at the news commentators that are out there, and I don't say anchor, I say commentators, because they do come with a certain bias. How do you do it so that you're delivering news and still believe what you believe and let your audience know where you stand?
Well, there's a difference between commentary and delivering the news.
Right.
As long as it's labeled commentary, I'm just fine with that. If you say, "I think this," then people should know these are your thoughts. As a journalist, I don't believe in objective because any more than I believe in a random number. We bring to any story who we are, what we've seen, what we've heard, what our experiences are. What I believe is that it is our job to be both honest and fair, and those are possible. Objectivity is impossible.
Yeah. When you look back at all the traveling you've done, all the places you've been, all the things you have learned, had you known those lessons back 30 years ago, how different do you think you would have lived your life?
I'm not sure I would have lived it much differently. I've had a real good time when I was writing Take Big Bites, which is a book about the fact that I spent more than 30 years traveling around the world and eating the food of the world while pretending to be a journalist.
It's a good excuse for a lot of things, isn't it?
It was a great excuse. I think what a gift it was that I was allowed to do this and to meet some of the world's most interesting people. I think the big regret I have is that because I was part of that first generation of women, they would say to us, "If you take time off for family-related matters, we'll know women aren't serious about this work. Not we'll know you aren't. We'll know women aren't." And, you really can't be at the school play at the same time you are at the political convention. Looking back, I wish I'd had the courage to say, no, I've got to be at the school play more often than I did.
Yeah. Are there regrets from all of that?
Sure, because corporations don't have a long memory, but kids do.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah. So now, when you look at some of the adventures you've had, and you say meeting the interesting people of the world, I think a lot of people would automatically assume what you're talking about are the heads of states and these folks. Would you think that the more interesting people are the quieter folks in the world?
I think so in many cases, but I think, having interviewed heads of state and serial killers, and sometimes those who were both, probably what I consider myself most fortunate about in interviewing is that I met the man who invented nachos. Now that's big.
So who invented nachos?
1943, and I didn't meet him in 43, I met him in the 70s. 1943, Piedras Negras, Mexico, across from Eagle Pass, Texas. The war is on. There's a base in Eagle Pass. Some women went across to Piedras Negras. They went to a place called the Victory Club. It was 4 p.m. They ordered margaritas and wanted something to eat while they got drunk. They asked the owner. He went in the kitchen. The chef was off because, it wasn't mealtime. There was a waiter there. And he told the waiter, make them something. The waiter didn't know how to cook. He looked around. He took some tortillas. He tore them in quarters, deep fried them. He plated them, making sure that none touched the other, sprinkled them with yellow cheese, broiled them, and then sliced fresh jalapenos and put them on top. Served them. The women said, these are delicious. What are they called? Here's how history gets made. You know how somebody named Patrick is called Pat, or, Joseph is called Joe? In Spanish, the short name for Ignacio, which was the name of the waiter, is Nacho. So the owner said, these are nachos especiales, nacho specials. These are like Joe's specials. Well, they became so popular, they stayed on the menu, and somewhere along the line, the apostrophe got lost, and they became called nachos. And when I was living on the border in 1970, Mr. Anaya, Nacho Anaya, Ignacio Anaya, had a restaurant in Piedras Negras called Nachos, and he told us then that he had invented the nachos, and I wasn't sure I believed him, but he made the best in the world. Later, I met his son, who ended up being a banker in Eagle Pass, and in fact is retired and still there. Every year now in Piedras Negras, I think it's October 21st, they have the International Festival of the Nacho to honor his father.
That is amazing. I never knew that. Yeah. But it's funny because something's got to come from everywhere.
That's right.
Someone's got
and that's big. I'm telling you, inventing nachos is bigger. It's probably more important than being a head of state.
And would that man have ever known the greatness of what he created that one day?
They tried, and I write about this in the book. Later on, his family tried to patent it, but it was too late. They had spread. I mean, today you can buy nachos in the Pittsburgh airport. Of course, they taste like real nachos about as much as I look like Jennifer Lopez.
Well, Miss Lopez, then tell me this. If you could live somewhere else than where you choose to live now, and of course you can, but you choose where you are, where else would you like to be? What would you like to call home?
Well, I live in New York City. But whenever I think about if I won the lottery and I could just live anywhere, it's always multiple places. One is Houston, one is Austin, one is probably in Piedras Negras, Mexico. One would be in the village of Villa, on the island of Santorini in Greece. I went there when I started to write Take Big Bites. I went to this village of 500 people because I didn't speak the language. I knew no one there. No one knew me. And it was 7 hours in time ahead of New York. And I thought, well, this is a great place. Well, I stayed there.
You here for 1 second.
Sure.
So one of my crew said to me when I was telling them the story about where you went, they said, why go someplace as beautiful as Santorini to write a book if you're not going to see people and you're going to kind of cut yourself off? Why didn't you pick like an apartment in Brooklyn? Why didn't you pick someplace else?
Because the publisher had given me a nice advance and I thought I'd spend it in case the book made no money. But what happened, he was right though about one thing. I went back 3 years running for a month. And of course, now I can't go back and write there because I do have friends there. I know people, I speak a little of the language. I can only go back now for vacation. I would have to find someplace else strange and beautiful to write another book.
Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt you when I did that.
Quite all right.
So you went there, you're writing the book, you're working on it. How do you stay on task when you've got this whole island before you?
Well, I would sit writing, in my little studio that I rented, 800 feet above the Aegean, looking at the Aegean. But I'm disciplined. I get up 5 every morning and would start writing, and I could write till 5 that afternoon before my office, Lucky Duck Productions in New York, would start calling and annoying me.
There you go, because of the time difference.
Exactly.
I never thought about that. So any other place that is a strange pick for a woman like you to want to live in?
I don't know. I think of where else would I like to live, and sometimes I think the Amalfi Coast in Italy. Because I've lived in New York so long, other than Houston or Austin, almost all the places I'd pick would be walking towns. Whether it would be New Orleans or Key West, Florida. I'm so used to living in neighborhoods where I can just get out and walk in my neighborhood to the dry cleaners, to the grocery store, to the restaurants.
Yeah. When you had your issues then back with cancer, and you're ill, and you can't get out and do that, was that almost the worst part of it for you?
I got out and did that.
Even at your
Absolutely. I didn't miss a day of work after I got out of the hospital from surgery. Now, there were some days I felt awful, and foods tasted strange, Yeah. But I still enjoyed it. I lived as though the cancer were never coming back, and I've been extraordinarily lucky. It's been 13 years, and every morning when I wake up, there's this little, wow, I'm still on the right side of the grass moment.
There's a story you tell about finding the lump and knowing that it was painful, that it hurt.
Yeah.
And your doctor said, so you have nothing to worry about.
That's a myth, and I didn't know that then, and obviously he didn't know that. And when I go out and make speeches about breast cancer, it's one of the first things I say. If you have a lump and it hurts, it's your body trying to tell you something. Go to a doctor.
Yeah. And if you hadn't, and as I understand it correctly, then you went to give a speech, And in doing research for the speech...
That's when I found out that that was a myth, and it was 6 months later. So, you know, I lost both my breast and all my hair, and, you know, the good news is, A, I lived, and then the other good news is at least my hair grew back.
Okay, take me over to the kids. I want to talk about all of the stuff you've been doing for them with Nick News and all of that. One of the big things people remember from, or two of the biggest ones, I would say, is probably the coverage of AIDS and then the Clinton scandal.
Well, you know, it's funny because I get asked so often, why do we cover stories like this for kids? Why can't we just leave them in ignorant bliss? And I tell them because kids can't really escape the world today. It's too much with us. Television is on all the time. So what we do is try to explain these events, give them a place to vent, hear their fears, hear their anger, let them ask questions, and talk to them. But whenever we have to cover a story about a bad thing that's happened, we always show good people trying to make it better. Because what we're trying to say to them is, you have a choice. You can make your world better.
Are there things you can't discuss with children? Are there some topics you can't get into?
No, there are none I wouldn't discuss. There are some we haven't. But if they became ragingly big campaign issues or news stories, we would discuss them.
How do you decide what you cover then?
Well, there are those we can't avoid, things like September 11th, AIDS issues. And then we look at issues that are big in kids' lives, like divorce, abuse, moving, things like that. And beyond that, it's sort of things that I think are important for kids to examine or to know about. We did a show about kids with AIDS in South Africa 2 years ago, and one of the reasons I did that is I wanted children to know that it's not just their story, that what happens there is our story too, and that we have a part in that story.
Are there areas, though, I know that this has come up before in just this own city here in Houston, where parents will say, we don't think children need to be hearing about this issue. Yes, it's a big thing, but they're too young to know about it. We don't need to discuss it. How do you confront that?
I don't confront it. I believe the First Amendment stops at your front door. I truly do. As a parent, you have a right, absolute right, to what your child watches. And I'm all for that. If it's a really tough issue, we always put an advisory at the top of the show for that purpose. Because I believe parents have a right to say, no, I don't want my kid watching this. What I don't believe in is that they have a right to tell me what I can't produce.
Have you ever had problems with that? Has that come to your door?
We did a show a couple of years ago because the most common hate word on elementary school playgrounds today is fag. We did a show simply about kids showing respect to kids who come from families who might be different. And there were groups that got together and, of course, who had never seen the show and tried to keep it from ever airing and made a big stink about it and tried to scare Nickelodeon from airing the show. But the show was about tolerance for these kids, and that's all it was about. And frankly, all of their objections, all it did was increase our ratings.
Don't you find that's usually what ends up happening, though, when they go and boycott you or picket about those?
And the day it aired, I debated Jerry Falwell on CNN. And at the end, they said, what's the last thing you want to say? And I said, with all due respect, Reverend Falwell, if we can't all be friends, can't we at least be better strangers to one another?
Yeah. Did he respond?
Well, no, the show was over then. I got the last word.
Yeah, good for you. Looking at all that we've gone through as a country now and where we're at today, do you feel we're handling things in the best possible way?
Not always. One of the reasons that I wrote Take Big Bites about travel was I wanted to encourage Americans to get out and travel, because I hear so many Americans talk about they're afraid to go overseas now because people don't like Americans, and I want them to not be afraid. If they go over there, they may find people who disagree with our government's policies, but often those people disagree with their own government's policies. They won't be mean to you as an American. And I also believe that if we get out there and we meet with one another and we break bread together and we share foods and we get to know their foods, then maybe we'll figure out that we are all more alike in this world than we are different. Yeah. And maybe then some of the fear-mongering that goes on to some extent in both governments and media will go away.
Yeah. How soon after 9/11 did you start traveling again?
I got on a plane on American Airlines flight from Kennedy to Los Angeles the first day they put the planes back in the air. I got on that 9 a.m. flight because, for a very simple reason, there's only one point to terrorism, and that's to terrorize you. And if you're not terrorized, it failed.
Were you petrified?
No, I was not. First of all, I am a journalist, and I looked around the cabin, and I was lucky enough to be sitting that day in first class, and there were 3 guys sitting in there whose shirts were tucked out like, Hawaiian shirts, and I looked, and they had on cop shoes and tucked out shirts, and I knew instantly they were federal marshals and they were armed. That's why they had the tucked out shirts. I made them instantly. So I felt very safe on that flight. Look, if I'm to be limited, let it be by the limits of the planet, and not my own cowardice.
Yeah. Talking about limits, things you still want to do, challenges that still face you that you want to tackle. What are they?
Well, I want to write fiction. And I haven't, that's a very scary thing. When you're writing nonfiction, you have a skeleton to work with, and you can add the flesh to it. But fiction is just filled with choices. Right. I think these books that I'm writing are more and more in a style. Take big bites. The stories, each chapter takes place at a different time in my life, in a different place in the world, and ends with a recipe. But the structure is more fiction-like. I mean, yeah, it's factual, but the structure itself is more fiction-like.
Yeah. So what area of fiction do you want to attack?
I'm not sure yet. It's too scary.
Talking about fiction with that blurred line to reality, true or false that Murphy Brown was based on you?
Well, I've heard that from a lot of people, and I will tell you that Diane English, the executive producer and inventor of Murphy Brown, called me, and she said, Candice Bergen and I want to do a show about a maverick newswoman. Can we follow you around for a couple of months? But, my own feeling is, gee, an anchor woman whose mouth is always getting her in trouble, what's not to like?
Yeah. Do you think the stories that they reflected kind of rang a bell of truth for you when you saw them?
I think they rang a bell for truth for almost all of us in journalism. Yeah. I think Murphy Brown is a compilation, of many of us, and there's a part of me in there, yeah.
When you get the awards, when you get the accolades, when they say that the things you have written for children are the best out there in news and across the board, not just for children, what does that say to you in the work you're doing?
Well, I'm always very grateful, but it always makes me question their judgment because I happen to know I'm a deeply flawed human being.
You wouldn't know that from reading your list of accolades that you have gotten. When you get that, though, are those the rewards for the work you're doing, or do you get your reward elsewhere?
I don't know. It's lovely to get rewards, like awards, but I don't think that's why we do it. I think we do it because of curiosity. That's what's kept me traveling. It was my father, right here in Houston, where I grew up, who first persuaded me that a foot in the road was not a bad place for a foot to be, and that when you talk to strangers, they stop being strangers. I still have that curiosity. It's why I travel. It's why I like to write about it. And I'm still hungry, so I still want to eat the world's foods. But I also still, I think like all of us, I carry memories, food memories. You know how a song will take you back to a place in time faster like that? Man, you hear a certain song and you're there. The only other thing that does that fast is taste. And I can eat my mama's fudge pie, which, by the way, the recipe is worth the price of the book. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I'm back in my mama's kitchen, and I'm a kid again here in Houston. And she's still alive. And that's what memories can do for us. When I come to Houston today, I head straight for Felix's Mexican restaurant for the queso. And that's such a great story, because the other thing that I love about food is how it changes the world and the connections between what we put in our mouth and the world around us. Here were two people, Janie and Felix Tijerina, the children of migrant workers who started this Mexican restaurant in the 30s, and really sort of one of the first Tex-Mex restaurants, and thought, if they get to know us through our food, maybe they'll like us. And then in the 50s, they noticed the dropout rate for Hispanic kids in schools, and they hired a 17-year-old girl to teach a group of kids 400 words of English before they started school. And the next year, every one of those children from that school, little school of the 400, everyone stayed in school. So they started more of these. Lyndon Johnson was president, and he invited the Tiarinas to his ranch, and they talked to him about this program. And it was the inspiration for the National Head Start program. And it came from people, Felix's Mexican Restaurant, who ostensibly dealt in tacos and the world's best chili con queso.
When you were writing the book and these stories kept coming to you, did you get sidelined? Did you sit there and all of a sudden go off into the memories and the thoughts about all these things and the remembrances of being there and all that? How did you get back on task to get the book written?
The fact that I had taken the publisher's money is a real motivator. Taking it and spent it would get me back on track. But, you know, when you write a book like this, you end up writing it way long, and then you start cutting down, and eventually it's a publishable length.
Yeah. Are there stories that you wish had been in there that had to go by the wayside?
That pulled 3 chapters out of the book at the end because the book was too long. And one of them may be the basis of the first novel I try and write.
Any hint?
Well, it takes place in Chicago when I was a folk singer in the early 60s, and when this is before Kennedy was killed, when everything seemed possible. And it's told through the eyes of the 6 people in this folk singing group and what changed during those 5 years.
Oh. We await your novel then.
I thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us.
My pleasure. And take big bites. It's an attitude about life.
Okay, Linda Ellerbee. To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.